the main thing is to help the child learn how to manage emotional pain and not be afraid of it. So I know our instinct is to protect children from emotional pain, but when we protect by avoiding talking about it or acknowledging it, we actually prevent the child from being able to develop resiliency around managing overwhelming feelings.
Okay. Hello and welcome back to the Mothership, the show that brings the issues that matter most to Irish families to the table. I'm Laura Cunningham, and this week we'll be discussing how to talk about difficult topics with your children like bereavement, trauma, and outside of that, some of the scary things that they'll be hearing on the news at the moment that might be making them feel a little bit confused and anxious. Today we're joined by Colleen Brown from Barnardos Children's Bereavement Services and parenting coach Aoife Lee. Guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Laura.
So look, it's inevitable that things are going to happen in life that we would probably prefer as parents to just protect our children from altogether. But, how to tell kids when things happen and how much to tell them is it's a source of concern for a lot of parents. So hopefully we can offer some support today. So Colleen, I'm going to come to you first. Now, there's a lot happening in the world right now, but, if we can bring it down a little closer into the family unit, I want to talk a little bit about when trauma, bereavement, things like that happen in a family where there are young children, how we navigate it with them. So if you can first of all just tell me, you're part of the bereavement service within Barnardos. So tell us a bit about that service and your role there.
Sure. So I work with the Barnardos Children's Bereavement Service. We're a national service and we have centres in Dublin and in Cork. We work with children and their families who are experiencing bereavement. Most of the families that we work with are experiencing loss due to sudden, unexpected or violent death. And so we provide trauma support as well as grief support. Our hope is to resource the family home to be able to grieve together. And we're aware that not all family homes can do that. And so we also work with the wider community and the adults who are encountering bereaved children on a daily basis in their community to try and help them better understand what bereaved children need. And then lastly, the widest circle is open to the public. It's our national helpline and it's there for any adult concerned about a bereaved child.
Okay, well it's brilliant to know that service is there. So, look, the big question is here, how much do we tell our children? Should we be protecting them from certain elements of it? I'm sure parents ask you this all the time. So, as a general thing, do you think it's important to let children in on what's happening?
I do think it's important to be honest in an age-appropriate way. Yeah. And that really involves knowing how to meet a child where they are. Yeah. For the adult, it also requires the adult to know how they are with what has happened. So there's a really important relationship that needs to be minded there in regards to the adult's relationship with their own trauma and their own grief. Sure. And being able to then recognize their child's trauma and grief. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different approaches to giving children age-appropriate information. Mm-hmm. The main thing is to help the child learn how to manage emotional pain and not be afraid of it. So I know our instinct is to protect children from emotional pain, but when we protect by avoiding talking about it or acknowledging it, we actually prevent the child from being able to develop resiliency around managing overwhelming feelings. Okay. So I know the instinct is to protect, but then we can end up actually preventing that child from finding their own way through tough feelings, and they can end up numbing them out and maybe getting addicted to what works best to numb it out.
Yes, okay.
As adults, I know a lot of us can identify with that.
Of course, It's so, you can't go around it, you have to go through it.
You have to go through it, and for children it's best to go through it together as a family. That's why we work with the whole family.
Aoife, you deal with parents directly a lot and you support them in supporting their kids. Yeah. So, you must see parents coming to you and they're dealing with their own trauma.
Yeah, and I can really understand where Colleen is coming from in that it is really important to open up that communication and give the kids permission to show their emotion. And sometimes they can struggle with identifying what those emotions are. They can feel it in their body, but they can often find it difficult to associate with what's going on at a given time.
Have the language to express what it is.
So it's kind of the validating those worries, and it can come out in all kinds of behaviours and like that, whether it's in school or at home with their peers. So certainly I would be in agreement. Validate those feelings and name them, because sometimes when we say, are you okay? Are you angry? Are you sad? Are you upset? Sometimes children can really find it difficult to connect with that. So it's naming the feelings, and I think when we name them, it makes our kids, as does for adults, it makes them feel somewhat appreciated and understood, and to identify that, it's okay as well.
So is it a case of saying, when something like this happens, a lot of people feel very this, and you might be feeling that way? Is that?
I would say so, and I know there are probably lots of different ways of how you can phrase things, but it's actually giving them the message that, these feelings are okay, and it's giving them that support, that you are there to kind of keep them safe and support them in any way you can.
So that they're not alone with the feelings. Colleen, you told us a gorgeous quote earlier on about it. Can you tell us again?
It is. It's one of my favourite quotes because it messages the importance of that parent-child relationship so well. So it's by Gabor Mate, who works in the area of trauma. And he says that children don't get traumatized because they get hurt. They get traumatized because they're left alone with the hurt. And so it's that aloneness, it's that isolation, it's that I can't tell anyone. It's that, for really young children, it's where do you start? Where are the words? So having an adult who's able to really be attuned, emotional attunement, and being able to notice, are you feeling okay today? Is there anything that you'd like to tell me? Or, how's your belly today? So a lot of children might carry worry in their belly, or do you need a hug? Or, I was feeling sad today. I'm missing Dad. I'm thinking about Dad today. How are you doing? It's that level of attunement so that however that child is feeling, they're not alone in what they're feeling.
So expressing your own feelings about it, that's helpful in the sense that it makes them feel less alone, would you say?
I think whether you find this with your own clients, but sometimes we can hide away from being emotional and upset and crying in front of the children. But
that would be my instinct as a parent. I don't want them to see me upset, but maybe that's not the right approach.
Well, I think we're all parents here today, and we've all been through different situations over the course of our lives, and certainly since I've had my own children, I think I would find it myself okay to express emotion in front of them, but like that, to a point where, it's not worrying them. And while I know we want to protect our children, it's also important that you're giving them permission to express that emotion. And if mum and dad or carers or guardians, whoever at home can do that too, well then it's just in that safe way. And just something you said there, Colleen, about when pains in the belly and maybe feeling nauseous, or that reluctance to go to school, or that separation, sometimes we can interpret it as a behaviour, but the likes of worry, anxiety and stress, all of those can come through the different day-to-day behaviours. It's not necessarily linked to maybe a given situation. I think that sometimes just to be tuned into that.
And a lot of this, obviously, how you approach this and the telling, as you call it, Colleen, is it depends what age this kid is, really, isn't it, or your children. So, Colleen, can you talk us through a little bit about those age, the milestones and what children are able to understand and at what age brackets?
Sure. In regards to cognitive development and the capacity to understand death, there is a milestone around the cognitive age of 4 or 5. So this may show up different in a child. I'm not talking about chronological age. I'm talking about cognitive age.
Okay. Yeah.
So for that age, around age 4 or 5, there's that awareness or capacity to realize that death is irreversible.
Okay.
So before that, it's the road runner. You can get knocked down and come back again, and this can be really tough on a parent, particularly if one parent has died, because a child every day is asking, You know,
when are they coming back?
When are they coming back? Okay. You know, where's mom? You know, is granddad going to be back for my birthday today? You know, and then that parent is reliving
That's tough, isn't it?
the loss, and you know, trying to find the words and all of that. So that's the irreversibility, is the ability to understand that death is permanent, basically.
And that's cognitive age around 4 or 5.
Yeah, age 4 or 5. Yeah, I saw it with my own kids, and there was a Charlie and Lola YouTube show, and there was a mouse that died, like a pet mouse that died, and I thought it was so brave of Charlie and Lola to take that on. But I was in the other room kind of doing the dishes, and then my 4-year-old daughter all of a sudden was like sobbing. And if I'd known about the content of the show, I would have been in there with her, you know, but I just didn't know Charlie and Lola were going to be so brave. So, but it was because she realized that mouse had died and that mouse wasn't going to come back to life. Yeah. Oh. So we just kind of had a big hug, you know, and talked it through and everything.
And is it helpful to explain that to a child? If they don't really understand it, is it important that you make them understand that?
Well, it is a part of life.
Yeah.
So it isn't something that we can avoid. And, you know, some children get through life without having a loved one die, like meaning they get through childhood without having a loved one die, maybe in their 20s before a grandparent dies or something. But the chances are that children are going to experience death. And so having a language, having a freedom and permission to acknowledge it and talk about it that's how you get through it. Okay. You know,
and so moving past then up until, is it 6 or 7 is the next kind of milestone?
Around age 6, 7, there's 2 others that they tend to hang together. And the first is universality. Okay. And that's the understanding that every living thing dies.
Okay.
And then the second is inevitability, that there's nothing we can do about that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, even just saying that, you know, there's a part of me that doesn't want to accept that, right? The immortality of youth and all these ways that we try and hang on to our lives. And so from a consciousness perspective, you know, that awareness cognitively can have an emotional impact, and it tends to be anxiety. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's just realizing that we actually are not in 100% control of what happens.
And I think that's what parents and families can struggle with, because there are certain elements in our child's life that we can't necessarily influence or control or manage. And, you know, we're sometimes grasping at straws trying to figure out, well, what can we influence? And that's why it's important to reassure parents and carers that there is still a lot that we can do outside of those life scenarios where, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. It makes a big difference.
And Aoife, you know, these are issues that happens within the family group, but your child is going to venture out then and go to schools and hobby groups. Is it important to, you know, communicate with them and get them involved in the healing process as such?
Yeah, well, I think, and Colleen and I were just even chatting about that peer support within bereavement and loss, and how, you know, some, like ourselves, like adults, children, like to have that connection with potentially someone else that has going through the same situation or scenario, because there's an element of understanding maybe, and it builds up that rapport. So there are, I know, other services out there that provide that peer support within the community, and I'd always say to my clients, if they have gone through a separation or a loss of some sort, to seek out if there are opportunities, and then it's also keeping connected with school, with teacher. And if you have got, let's say, a family member that's ill in hospital, maybe you have got the adults going in and out of the hospital, and, you know, keeping that communication open with school's principal and the child's teacher, so that they're aware. And I know not everyone wants to share their business, but when it comes to such emotional upheaval that can often create a lot of chaos at home. Yeah. When there's that communication open at school, it can make a difference in that transition from going to home into school and then school back to home again. You know.
And if you have, and hopefully you have, managed to create that kind of atmosphere of we're all in this together and we're working through it at home, you take for them to feel that then they go into school and they're just kind of freewheeling. So making it a community is, I presume, how do you feel about that, Colleen?
Absolutely. Yeah. We do a lot of work in schools just to create that continuum, like you were saying, Aoife, you know, where the child feels held whether they're in the family home or whether they're at school, and they know that people have their back.
Yes.
And they know that if they're having a tough day, they can tell a trusted adult about that, and that adult will respond in a way that's helpful, that makes it better rather than makes it worse.
Yeah.
And it applies, and we've spoke about anxiety and worry, and even it doesn't have to be the big stuff. It could be like a pending separation.
Yeah.
Maybe a child is going from one house to the next, and likewise, or there's just general anxiety overall. That if that is noted with school and your child actually knows that, let's identify maybe the person that we can speak to, and they'll know your story and your situation. So if you're having a moment where you feel overwhelmed, you can go to that adult, so that there is a safety net within, because kids cope a lot better. I'm sure, Colleen, you'd agree that kids cope a lot better when they know what's happening, because it creates that security, that trust. And, like us all, we do like to know a plan, and then it just feels that little bit safer, particularly when things are a little bit unpredictable.
I like that idea of them not having to explain themselves to somebody in school, that they know, the person, the teacher, whoever it is, knows what's going on, and they don't have to pull the language from their, little kid brain to say, like, my parents are separating or whatever it is. So keep everyone in the loop and know that your child has another team member within the school.
I think, to be honest, these days with schools, they want to do what they can do to help and support families, and it is that whole feeling of everyone working together. So I think if you are hesitating, or if there's any kind of viewers that are wondering what to do, reach out. People want to help and people want to be there, and if it makes your child's life that little bit easier, then it'll be met with confidentiality and respect.
Absolutely. And I mean, outside of school settings, what services are there available for parents who are struggling? Like, so within Barnardos, there's a helpline, you're saying?
With the bereavement service, yes, there's the helpline. And so any adult concerned about a bereaved child, parent or family member, professional can phone. Barnardos, the wider Barnardos organisation also has a parent helpline that parents can phone for any reason, at all.
Okay.
I know there's Parent Line as well as another option. There's just fantastic resources out there nowadays. Parents need to know they're not alone with the hurt as well.
Yeah. And the last 2 years have really emphasised a lot of family dynamics and situations, and I think now more than ever those services are there on the forefront, trying to help as many families as possible.
I want to kind of have a conversation about what's going on in the world right now and what our kids are hearing and how that might be for them. Only a couple of recent examples are, of course, Aisling Murphy's high profile awful murder, and now everything that's going on in Ukraine. They're going to be picking things up just by osmosis, overhearing things on the radio. There'll be kids in their class who are talking about it. There's always that one kid who knows more than everyone else and decides to tell them what, it's really natural. So I guess I just want to touch on, how do we equip our kids to hear about things that we're barely equipped to hear about ourselves, And
it's interesting you should say that, because so much news stories, images that are quite distressing for the adults' eyes and ears, never mind our young children. I've got, 4.5-year-old, a 10 and a 13-year-old, and I can see each of the kids looking and surveying everything and all this kind of information that's coming in. My youngest being completely oblivious. So we are choosing not to, share any information with him, because he's on another level altogether. He has his own agenda. But certainly the 10-year-old and the 13-year-old, this probably coincides with the different stages that you described there about grief and trauma. You can see them processing the information differently. And, like you mentioned, Aisling Murphy, this rocked the country. Yeah. And like that with Ukraine, it's real life. And Colleen, you mentioned at the very beginning there, our natural instinct is to protect the kids. However, in the same kind of wording, we cannot control everything that they're going to hear. So
with social media alone, it's, switching off the news on the TV is not a barrier between our children and this horrible information anymore. Not the one that it once was.
Absolutely. And I would have been one of those parents who were in the car and I would turn it down. Now, I would still do if it's a really horrific news headline, and even my 10-year-old now, when she doesn't want to hear something, she will also turn it down. However, what's really important, and it goes back to the validating those fears, those worries, those concerns, and maybe finding out if they do come to you or they are making comments or questions, or even, I know my 13-year-old, he wants to kind of know more detail. It's giving them some sense of, or even finding out, like, what do you know already? And it's okay to not have the answer to every question that they ask you.
I think that's a really important point.
Because as parents, and it's like through the pandemic, there was so many questions that we had that we didn't have the answer to, that sometimes we put ourselves under pressure to have that solution for our kids because that's our job, when really it's not always practical, it's not always realistic. So because with Ukraine and the war that is unfolding, in front of our eyes, it's all a little bit unpredictable at the moment, and there's new stuff coming in all the time. So I think, again, when you're dealing with bereavement and trauma, it's trying to be as age appropriate in your facts, and actually trusting your own gut, that you know your own child best, you know what they're able for, and it's gauging that. And if they do come to you and they put you on the spot, and you're like, oh, what am I going to say? You say, I understand why you're asking me that question, and I that's okay. Leave it with me, and actually, come away and think, right, I need to gather my thoughts here on this and decide how I'm going to phrase this. I don't know whether you're not avoiding, but you're certainly, because sometimes we can come out with stuff.
God knows what you come out with on the spot.
And you're like, oh, just say something, if anything. And it's okay just to go, okay, thanks for that. Leave it with me and I'll come back to you now, shortly. And look, I think at the end of the day, when it comes to our smaller kids, as they grow, they become a lot more aware of the world. They become a lot more aware that not everyone is kind and good. And there's that realisation that shininess of everyone's amazing, it comes to light.
Yeah, I mean, Colleen, you deal with children who have, trauma that goes beyond just bereavement, maybe, violent crime and awful situations. With that sort of thing, and indeed, with world news and what's going on, is it a good idea to explain that there are bad people in the world, or is that frightening? That's something that I kind of struggle with myself. I don't know where, how do you explain that some people do really bad things to a child without frightening them?
Well, in Barnardos, we work with children who unfortunately have experienced that life can be cruel. In the bereavement service, these children are learning that anything can happen to anyone at any time.
It's awful, isn't it?
And, and children who are learning that, if the death is due to homicide, children that are learning that people can be cruel. So these are big learnings, and again, the most important thing is that a child is not learning about that on their own. They're learning with adults who are also trying to find a way through it by finding words for it, and naming the feelings and kind of naming them to tame them, the name it to tame it piece, so that they're all in it together. But I do think that, like in Barnardos, we focus, not on the person, on the behavior.
Okay.
And so I think that talking about good people and bad people, while with children aged 2 to 7, they're in that concrete, pre-operational, black and white way of thinking. I think that a more helpful thing to talk about is people who do bad things or people that do harmful things. Because you're introducing those critical thinking skills that will develop with age. You can talk with teenagers about that in a really different way than you can talk about with a 6-year-old. But for example, I have a boy he's coming 6 soon, and so the way we've been talking about what's happening with the Ukraine is, unlike his older sister who's asking me questions every day, and is super confident in regards to, being really verbal, he's still developing, his verbal skills. And so because he's not able to bring questions to me as much, I've been checking in with him around, I know we're listening to something that's talking about war. Do you have any questions about that? And he'll say, no, I just want to play on my iPad and things like that. So I've just been kind of checking in with him.
Okay.
But he did bring to me, just this morning, I hopefully, because he knows that he can bring anything to me, he did say, is Russia a bully? So he's using like the cognitive schema he has for how power is used, to try and understand what's happening in the world.
It's very clever.
So I guess not to underestimate what's in the mind of children, at different ages. And like you said, what is being said outside of the family home, you don't have control over that. But creating that safety, whether it's following the lead of kind of a middle, older child, when they ask you a question, it's a good sign that they're ready for the answer. Or with younger, more pre-verbal children, just checking in, dropping it in there, letting them know that it's okay to talk about anything, that all questions are okay. And then when they're ready, they'll bring it.
Okay.
So.
That's actually really interesting about talking about people who are not fair, or rather than good people and bad people. I think that's really a helpful way of looking at it, and because our kids are so susceptible, they're just like sponges, aren't they? And they will pick up on lots of different kind of language used. So that's really a really helpful tip.
And do you think, Aoife, it's helpful, say in situations like what's going on in Ukraine, to get your children involved in helping in some ways, or is that putting the responsibility of the world on them? What's your perspective on that?
Well, only in the last number of days there has been different organisations gathering up humanitarian aid. And even, with Jamie, my youngest lad, who's in Nenra, he's only in like second year preschool, and his teacher is collecting. So for any families that want to donate lots of different supplies, and that's something that I'm going to do with the kids, and for them to know that this is for the Ukraine people, for children of their own age, of having mums and dads that are the same as us.
Yeah.
So what it shows is an element of compassion, an element of care, and that actually also can impact on their own self-esteem and that sense of, there are others that are less fortunate than ours, and it just gives them that other view on it. So
showing them that the world is not all bad. It's probably a welcome message right now, I guess.
Yeah, it's just that we can help without getting into too much of, what's going to happen to Ukraine and like that is Russian the bully. This is kind of taking it and taking an element of what we can do to help. If anything, this is what we can do.
I think there are lots of different acts of solidarity.
Yeah.
And, there are the acts of thinking, what can we do as a family? Maybe looking at your own circle of friends, and maybe there are people from Ukraine, from Russia, from Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, who are really affected by what's happening. And, so a commitment as a family to check in with so-and-so or offer so-and-so a cup of tea. And then there are ways of donating to needs, either financially, or through sharing other resources and things. But there's also the act of solidarity of really taking one day at a time as a family, being in the moment, enjoying the safety and the love within the family home, hopefully, if it's there, that's our hope for every child. And enjoying the freedom that we have, because the people of Ukraine are likely thinking back to last week before this and wishing that they had been able to really enjoy what they had before they lost it. And they wouldn't want us, to be deprived of something that they, would so want for themselves. And so I think we can feel guilty for being happy when we're watching the suffering of other human beings. And particularly in Europe, there's this sense of closeness. They belong to us. This isn't supposed to be happening here, but there is a importance of taking care of ourselves and, enjoying the freedom that we do have and not taking that for granted. I think that's also an act of solidarity.
Yeah.
I think that's a lovely place to leave it, because I'm afraid we're out of time on that positive note. This has been really helpful, and I think, it's helpful to know that there are resources available should you find yourself in, one of these really unfortunate positions. But also, I think for parents listening to know that, we're not perfect and we'll do our best as best we can for our kids, but, we might be struggling too. So just to go a bit gentle on ourselves.
Yeah, lean on each other.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much. That's all we have time for this week. As I mentioned, we'll leave all the details of everything we spoke about today below. We'll see you next week.